we covered the first few verses of Ephesians 4. And I always like to recap in our verse by verse because everything is connected in text, no chapter verses, no original chapter verses, and no original verse breaks. There's a universal tone to Ephesians. We discussed that in the introduction, but there ain't no doubt, for the reasons discussed, that this was meant as a letter that would be circulated, even if it originally went to a key congregation, and is parallel with Colossians. So, a letter that is meant to be read by a variety of congregations or Christians. And you certainly see that in the text, right? What you see is universal truths that are good for every Christian. So we have that in the beginning, right? We have great theological truths in the beginning. God's eternal purpose with the church. Well, that's something for every congregation, for every Christian, for all ages to know, that the church was always God's eternal purpose and Him working through that. Now, is there specific application? Yes, Jew and Gentile, that wall of division being broken down. So he touches on that. He touches on that in chapter 2, very much so, in the latter part of the chapter. Now, it's a specific application, but it turns up to be very applicable in our day and age too, because of dispensationalism, which is the idea, one of which is the idea that the Jews are still the people of God. So we've touched on that. But saying these great theological truths, in chapter 3, began to get into very practical matters, love, unity. And then chapter 4, of course, a continuation of that as it was in the first verses. But I'll go over them again, though. Therefore, I, the prisoner of the Lord, exhort you to walk worthy of the calling which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing one another in love, being diligent to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body, one Spirit, just as also you were called in one hope of your calling. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all, and through all, and in all. Last time we talked about this, of course, we went over these features that Christians are unified. We talked about the one baptism. We talked about one God and Father. But you see the Trinity too, and which is an interesting concept in passages like these. That you had one Spirit, and then you have the reference to Christ, one Lord, and then one God and Father. Now, I like to touch on sometimes things in passing that aren't overly relevant to us. And the reason is because we interact with so many people. But, you're probably going to have Mormons knock on your door sometime. Mormons are an interesting persuasion of people, and they're very nice. Last time we talked a lot about, or I made several statements about Jehovah's Witnesses. And by the way, I'll be speaking on that in Louisiana. But the Mormons are an interesting group. As much as we kind of acknowledge that Jehovah's Witnesses are a fringe group, that they are very cultish, the truth of the matter is Mormons are much further from true Christianity than Jehovah's Witnesses. And if you don't know, I like to tell people because they don't make this overly apparent, but Mormons, when you're having Bible studies, what they don't say, which is very true, is that they believe in a multiplicity of gods. And I think that's they got top error. If you're going to say, well, what are the major errors of Mormonism? Well, there's a list, and there's several at the top. That's one of them, if not the. If you can't get that right, it's hard to get anything else right. And so that's what makes them far from true Christianity. As nice as they are, and I like studying with them. They're easier to study with than Jehovah's Witnesses because they don't mind pushback, and they don't mind, going back and forth. Jehovah's Witnesses do, But they believe in an infinite number of gods. They believe that men become gods and that God himself used to be a man, come from the planet Kolob. And I like to say that because a lot of times they don't make that apparent. In fact, if you ask them, because I asked them, I said, so you believe in many gods? Sometimes they'll say, well, we believe in one God. But really what they mean is they believe in one God for our planet. You see, in their belief, whoever becomes a god gets your own planet. You get your own planet as a god, and you kind of rule over that. So our God, we have one God for our planet, but there are other gods out there. And they actually believe in more gods than there are fingers in this planet to count them on. So just from that belief alone, let alone many others, are they far from Christianity. But that is one thing that Christians unite over, one God, one Lord, and all these things. It's a great passage, really, a great passage of unity. And that is a practical application. There are things that there are doctrines that we not always on the same page on, even within those that we fellowship, but there are some things that are of top priority to get right. And anyway, of course, we're not Mormons, I realize that. But, the Mormons show up, and they're very friendly people, and they'll talk to you. So it's good to know about that. So, okay, but we did cover that. So verse 7 now says, but to each one of us, and I'm going to kind of read here a little bit, and then we'll go back and comment. But to each one of us, grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore it says, when he ascended on high, he led captive a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men. Now this expression, he ascended, what does it mean? Except that he also descended into the lower parts of the earth. He who descended is himself also he who ascended far above all the heavens, so that he might fill all things. And he himself gave some as apostles, some as prophets, and some as evangelists, and some as pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of service, to the building up of the body of Christ, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and the full knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man, to the measure of the stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ, so that we are no longer to be children, tossed here and there by waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, by craftiness and deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, we are able to grow up in all aspects into him who is the head, that is Christ, from whom the whole body being joined and held together. I really like this statement. But being joined and held together by what every joint supplies, according to the properly measured working of each individual part, causes the growth of the body for the building up of itself in love. I like that last lines, and I like, I don't use the King James, but I like the way the King James renders that last portion too. But, okay, let's back up here. Verse 7, but to each one of us grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gift. Christ gives gifts. Okay, we've talked about this because he talked about gifts earlier, but, you read of spiritual gifts. A lot of times we call them spiritual gifts. And generally what we mean by that is the miraculous gifts. You could call natural gifts that God gives spiritual, in the sense that he gives them for spiritual purposes, So if someone has the gift of preaching, if they're a great orator, it might not be miraculous, but you can call it a spiritual gift. But there's miraculous that they had, and what we might call natural, for lack of a better word, a non-miraculous gift, but they're still gifts. And God, I do believe, enables different Christians to serve different purposes. And for the same point, for the same purpose, to have a mutual benefit of the church. That's what it says. To each one of us grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gift. Okay, it says in verse 8, therefore it says, and this is a quote from Psalm, when he ascended on high, led captive a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men. Now I say that's a quote, it's somewhat of a quote, and as Paul does sometimes, or as different Bible writers do. There's different ways to connect to the Old Testament. So it's not a verbatim quote because he modifies it a bit. And he does this from time to time. You'll see it, where Paul, sometimes it's so differently worded that it's not a quote, kind of an allusion or a connection, but something that Paul wants to take from the Old Testament, either by inspiration, expand it and say, here's a little bit more to know about what God was talking about. I believe sometimes he just takes an idea and wants to build upon it, not necessarily to make some revelation about it, but just to use it kind of like you've heard it said this way, and he reworks it. But this quote is from Psalm 68, which I'm going to go to here. Psalm 68. Now it's 18. I'm going to back up a bit. In fact, I'll just start in 15. 68:15 is Psalm. It says, a mountain of God is the mountain of Bashan. A mountain of many peaks is the mountain of Bashan. Why do you look with envy, O mountains with many peaks? This is God's great city. This is his people, really. Figurative language. Jerusalem, Israel was his mountain. Why do you look with envy, O mountains with many peaks, at the mountain which God has prized for his habitation? Surely Yahweh, or Jehovah in the King James, will dwell there forever. The chariots of God are myriads, thousands upon thousands. The Lord is among them, as at Sinai. In holiness, you have, now here's the quote, the modification, of course. You have ascended on high. You have led captive your captives. You have received gifts among men, even among the rebellious also, that Yah, that's the shortened form of his name, God may dwell there. So this is about the beauty of his people and his victory of conquering. So first of all, the idea of conquering captives, that's the idea of a king that conquers his enemies. They take captives, right? And they also get tribute, and they get gifts from their enemies, and as it says there, even among the rebellious. We've seen this in the movies. The king conquers his enemy, and then he parades through the cities with his people shouting, and sometimes you see, we have to use the movies because we don't have history with kings here anymore, and then he got their enemies in chains, and they're kind of in procession behind them. And then gifts are given. This is the idea of celebrating the victory of the king. But here it says, you have received gifts. And then, of course, when Paul reads it, or when he writes this, he says, well, first of all, when he ascended, which isn't a big change, he's talking about. He says, he led captive a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men. But really, it's not, we see what he's doing, right? The king is conquered, and he has received gifts, but the generous king, according to Paul here, is that he's now giving gifts to his own people. He gets gifts, but you know what? He gives gifts back. And, of course, he's going to name some gifts here in just a second. He's going to have, as Paul does, this is typical Paul, he starts to say something, and then he has a side note, and he goes off on the side a little bit. Sometimes he'll do that for a long time and then come back. You see the personalities of these writers, in their. You see that in Romans 5 when he starts at verse 12, and then he goes off on this big thing and comes back to it in verse 18. But in fact, some translations, I don't remember if the King James does this, but my translation puts it in parentheses the next verse. It says, now this expression, he ascended, and this is before he goes back to the gifts, but he says, now this expression, he ascended, what does it mean except that he also descended into the lower parts of the earth? Well, actually, so I wasn't finished on a couple of comments there on verse 7, so let me pause on verse 9 there. But 7 and 8, the captives, I think it's pretty apparent in the verse in Psalm that it's his enemies being taken captives. There's also another view, and this isn't impossible because Paul is modifying it towards what he has done in the New Testament. But the clear thing could be, not the clear thing, but the thing that Paul is doing could mean that the captives are those who were captive by sin. And he has taken them to release them. Now, the New Testament clearly teaches that. The bondage of people to sin, it's what Jesus says in John chapter 8. He that commits sin is a slave to sin. It talks about that in Romans 6. So that's a motif in the New Testament. That we were captive, and that there's now liberty. So that the king takes those who were captives of the enemy and releases them. Now, which one does he mean? Well, it's kind of hard to tell because Paul's somewhat modifying the ideas in this quote. And he's under inspiration and he served Christ, he could do that. But whether he has modified it from the original, kind of like he did in that last verse, I don't know. But either way, it's true, right? Okay, but then he says, once again, back in verse 9, now this expression, he ascended, what does it mean except that he also descended into the lower parts of the earth? He who descended is himself also he who ascended far above all the heavens. Okay, what does that mean? Well, there's kind of three views of what he's talking about. One of them, I don't think there's any credibility for. Two of them, you can go either way, but I think the most likely one is that he means that he's saying he reads from the Psalm, which mentions that he ascended. Now, and I didn't comment on this, but that's apparent the way it is applied in the New Testament, right? That's his ascension. He conquered death and then finally ascended to the right hand of God. There's no doubt that that's the ascension that is being referred to here. And that's his conquering too. When Christ ascended, he was a conqueror. In Matthew chapter 28, just before he ascended, he said, all authority is given to me in heaven and earth. Meaning, I'm at the top of the chain now. That's king. That's his kingship. He is king. And he says, go into all nations, teaching them the gospel. He says, baptizing them, teaching them. Meaning, now that I'm king, go and preach the gospel so that people surrender. And that's what the gospel is. I've said that 100 times. The gospel is the terms of the king's surrender. It's the good news of you surrender to the king, serve the great and glorious king that Christ is, and you will be saved from the wrath of his judgment. That's what the gospel is. Okay, and that's what it is. So, and then he ascends to sit at the right hand, kind of like enthroning him, right? Well, so that's what the ascension is. And so when Paul says that, he makes a side note about the ascension. Okay, but we get that. There's not much disagreement on that. The question is, what does the descension that he's talking about? Especially because it says into the lower parts of the earth. Okay, well, so I think the most likely view is just making the thought that he that has ascended had to first descend. This is kind of making a statement about his pre-incarnation. In other words, that he, to ascend, had to come down first. Well, to ascend, or not even necessarily that he had a first, but just to state the fact that he did. That this wasn't someone just started their existence on earth. In other words, this is the great Son of God who pre-existed his time here, so that before he ascends, he has to descend. Now, there's some translations that will say first. That, we can't be sure on the word first there. I'm not going to get into why. It's just, it's not certain. But nevertheless, I believe the fact is he's just saying, and he's having a side note. He's saying, now that he ascended, he first had to descend so that he could ascend, which speaks of the glory of Christ first existing with God in eternity past. He had to descend to ascend. And We see this same thought in another place, by the way. John chapter 3. John is going to say basically the same thing. Now, this is when Jesus was talking with Nicodemus, and in verse 13, and I believe this, if I could make this note here, Jesus was talking in the first person, But I believe that, and it's not a big deal, but it's kind of important here because I believe this is John. He has stopped quoting Jesus, and John has started commenting himself on his own text. And I'll say more about that here in just a second. But it says in verse 13, no one has ascended into heaven, but he who descended from heaven, the Son of Man. Now, I think that's John in later times after Jesus has already ascended. So now, like in my Bible, that's in red letters. It's because translators and scholars, people that read Greek, you can't always be certain where Jesus stops being quoted and the writer, John, starts commenting on the text or what he has already said. So is this the commentary of John, or is this John still quoting Jesus? I don't believe, it's inspired one way or the other, but my point is, I think it is John. In fact, I believe verse 16, the famous passage, for God so loved the world that he gave. I think that's John making commentary. Because it makes sense, because I don't think John at this time fully understand the giving of, or at the time of Jesus speaking. I don't think anybody would have fully understood that, and that doesn't necessarily stop Jesus from saying it. But I think it's John in later decades commenting, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son. He's writing about what he already understood after the ministry of Christ was finished. Christ had already ascended. But if you notice in verse 13, that would make sense, right? Because if Jesus was standing there talking to Nicodemus and said, no one has ascended into heaven, nobody quite would even know what in the world he's talking about because he hasn't ascended yet. Okay, but I digress from that thought. But connecting this to what we just said, it's the same thought, right? That the one who ascends is the one who first descended. And the significance of saying that is the same idea, that this was someone who pre-existed his time on earth. This is someone who come down from a glory. This is someone from preeminence, lowering himself and then returning. So, in Ephesians, verse 9, it says, he also descended into the lower parts of the earth. Now you have to ask the question, that's a weird way to say it if he just simply means earth. Yeah, perhaps. But, the Bible writers oftentimes spoke in odd ways to us because, they were writing 2,000 years ago and even more, depending on which letter you're reading. Actually, the term lower parts of the earth can mean different things somewhat if you find its similar phrases in the Old Testament. So, for example, in Psalm 139, it says, my frame was not hidden, in this verse 15, talking about his body. It says, my frame was not hidden from you, God, when I was made in secret and intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Kind of sounds like he's talking about the womb, right? What else would he be talking about? The depths, the secret places in the earth, like in the womb. Another time it's used perhaps to refer to the place of the dead. But nevertheless, it's kind of one of those terms you just kind of look at in context. Now, in this verse, it's not, to think about it in the terms of it just talking about the earth, you think, well, it's kind of odd to say the lower parts of the earth. Well, actually, this is kind of a Jewish way of speaking. In the Gospels, they'll speak about the regions of Galilee, and by that they just mean Galilee. It's kind of the Jews have this way of speaking when they use of for everything, you know. The abomination of desolation. You heard that? Well, that's just kind of the way they throw the word of in a lot of ways of descriptions. But so the lower parts of the earth could just mean the earth. Just as it said, the lower parts, that is the earth. Kind of like the regions of Galilee just means the area that is Galilee. Okay, but I did tell you that there are other views, and I'll just say what they are. The second one, some people take it to mean into the grave. Well, in other words, he that ascended is the same one that died and was buried. Okay, I can get that. I mean, that's true. I just don't think it's the likely meaning. Jesus did say that just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights, the Son of Man be in the sea, so the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth. So it's not a big deal either way, but he doesn't kind of comment on what he's saying there about the burial. Okay, now there's one more view, which I don't think has any credence, but I'll go ahead and tell you what it is. There is the belief in some persuasions that Jesus died and went to hell, what we call hell. I mean, where there's fire and punishment, you know, that concept. That view has arisen, you know, there's people that believe it. I don't think there's any credence to that. But the idea is that to be the sacrifice appropriate for us, when he died, he went to hell, was suffering there, and then even preached to them at some point. A lot of this comes from a persuasion of people that are, this is the names, I didn't make it up, the King James onlyist. And that just refers to a group, you know, let's say if you don't use the King James, you're going to hell, that kind of thing. But it comes from Acts chapter 2, when it says, talking about Christ, it says, you will not leave my soul in hell, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. The truth is, that is not a good translation of the word. The King James the translators took, and I think King James is overall a good translation. But this is one of the worst that they have. They took actually 3 words, but I'll just talk about 2 of them. They took 2 words that mean different things, and they translated them both with the English word hell. The one in Acts chapter 2, when it says, you will not leave my soul in hell, is the same, it's the equivalent, it's the word Hades or Hades, as we've heard it pronounced. And it's the equivalent, in fact, in the Hebrew, it's Sheol. It's just the word that they used for the grave, the place of the dead, where you would go whether you're righteous or wicked. It did not refer to what we call hell. I don't believe there's anybody in hell, personally. I think the Scripture teaches that that's a punishment to come. But nevertheless, when it says, you will not leave my soul in Hades, and newer translations will say something equivalent to that, Hades, it's talking about the grave, the place of the dead. In other words, he didn't stay dead, and his body didn't corrupt or corrode or rot. He was brought back to life. But in the King James, it says hell, and so this belief developed that, okay, so his soul was in hell. He was down in hell, you know. And there's another passage which they kind of use, which I won't get into. But I don't believe there's any credence to him going to hell or anything like that. But I'll digress from that point. I don't believe that's what it means at all. And we'll continue on here. Okay. Nevertheless, it says in verse 11, and he himself gave some as apostles, some as prophets, some as evangelists, some as pastors and teachers. Well, so these are the gifts that he gave. Now, this isn't a comprehensive list, no doubt. Well, let's talk about some of these things, okay? You notice, I want to make a note here. What's interesting is here you have a list of offices that cry of roles, if you will, official roles that Christ has established in his church, among his people. Okay, you got apostles. Now, this is the same thing I was doing earlier. I like to comment on things when I have opportunity. But you notice this list here, and there's another list like it. And apostles is there at the beginning. Now, we have the most popular, the largest group of people called Christians is our friends, the Catholics, the Roman Catholics. And I see them becoming more prominent these days because of social media. You know, a lot of the conservative commentators are Catholic, if you know who they are. I mean, some of you may not follow them, but a lot of people do in our day and age. Matt Walsh, Michael Knowles, Candace Owens, I mean, the list will go on. And so, since a lot of popular conservative people that a lot of Christians like are Catholic, it seems to be on the rise to me anyway. But one of the most fundamental elements of our friends' beliefs, their whole system, is the papacy, the position of the Pope. Now, that's the most significant because, according to them, he is the head of the church on earth. That's a key element, that he is the ultimate authority, at least on earth, they say, for the Catholics. But yet, when you have a list right here, when he lists the gifts given, he completely leaves it out. He's got another list like it. In fact, in the other list, he says, and he gave to the church first, he says, apostles. And then he goes on, but yet he leaves it out again. It's interesting to me that Paul here has two lists. I mean, not here, but in his letters, he has two lists of things like this. And he leaves out, evidently, the most significant role in the church, if our Catholic friends are correct. I mean, the most significant, the one on which it all hangs, because he's the head of the church. Now, why in the world would Paul leave out the most important position of the church, especially in the list where he says he gave to the church first apostles? Apostles is important, but you're not more significant than the papacy. Well, because there is no papacy. I mean, that such a position was never established. Paul never mentions it up, and by the way, neither does Peter. But I digress. Now, I'll also say this. We do have some in our Pentecostal friends, the idea, some of them, and in Mormonism, by the way, that there are still modern day apostles. Okay, so they only have apostles. Now, is that the case? Well, first of all, I've already talked about how the word apostle can be a generic apostleship. If a congregation sends a preacher to work somewhere or preach, representing them or whatever, well, there's an apostle of that church, you know. If the church here decides, you know, we want you to go and represent us and preach somewhere or something, and then they send, and this church here sends me, I become an apostle of this church. Okay, that's generic use of the apostle. And that's used in the New Testament, by the way. You have to recognize it. But then you have, of course, what we call the 12 apostles and Paul. These are apostles of Christ, which have to be chosen by Christ. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but besides the fact that there are specific qualifications mentioned in Acts chapter 1 about who can be an apostle, we do have the earlier statement in Ephesians. And it says in chapter 2, at the end of chapter 2, it was talking about Jew and Gentile coming. It was talking about the church. And then it said this. Let's begin in verse 19. He says, so then you are no longer strangers and sojourners, but you are fellow citizens with the saints. And that's talking about Jewish Christians, which means we are Israel, and are of God's household, his house. Speaking of the church as the house of God, figuratively, the temple. And then he says, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the cornerstone. Now, what's significant is a foundation is laid at the beginning. You lay a foundation at the beginning, you don't lay it again 2,000 years if you've been building. Hey, let's put another foundation at the top. No, your foundation is laid at the beginning, and then you build upon that until it's finished. Well, the foundation consists of the apostles and prophets. And those are New Testament prophets, by the way. I know that from chapter 3, which we've already discussed. So New Testament apostles and prophets and Jesus were the foundation, which you don't lay again. What they did, of course, continues. We have their letters right here, and the letters of those who worked with them. So their work continues on, but that's because they came at the beginning, and we continue to build upon them. The way in which we build upon them is by furthering Christianity because of their work. But you don't need modern-day apostles. So, nevertheless, this belief that you have modern-day apostles, I reject for that reason, among others. But you have apostles, he says, and prophets. Apostles, some as prophets. And I want to say once again, he's talking about New Testament prophets. Not that the Old Testament prophets aren't key in the establishing of Christianity. I mean, they laid the foundation of Christ's work. But I might as well just read it. In chapter 3, though, he said, starting in verse 4 of chapter 3, he says, talking about his ministry, it says, about which when you read, you can understand my insight into the mystery, the hidden truths of Christ, which in other generations was not made known unto the sons of men, as it is now revealed to his holy apostles and prophets. So the prophets that Paul has been speaking about in combination with the apostles are ones to whom now, in his day and age, the gospel and New Testament revelation have been revealed. So it's not Old Testament prophets, it's New Testament prophets. And the apostles, of course, were more preeminent than the New Testament prophets, but you did have the prophets in the New Testament. We read about them in the book of Acts. Okay. But you notice that in chapter 2 that we read, that was a part of the foundation, the New Testament apostles and prophets. There are no modern-day prophets. That's my belief. I know that's all of our beliefs. We are called what you call cessationists. We believe the miraculous gifts of the New Testament era ceased. Cessationists. And it's part of it because such things, prophets, apostles, were part of the foundation. Okay, he says, some as evangelists. Now, they are things that continue because it's just the common work of traveling and preaching. Some as pastors and teachers. Well, pastor is not used very much in the New Testament, but when it is used, it's elsewhere just equated with the elders. In the New Testament, and this is agreed upon by others more than you might realize, even those who don't utilize the system, but in the New Testament, you had a plurality of elders, generally, not one elder, not one pastor. They have the one-man pastor system today, but pastors were elders in the New Testament, and you always had this position of a plurality of elders being leaders. And that's the New Testament way to do it. But it says some as pastors or elders, some as, an elder would shepherd. That's the idea. Some as teachers. And we got teachers today. I don't want to beat a dead horse, I've said this, but you got different people. And different teachers have different gifts according to their ability, I've said that some teachers will appeal to a lot of people and others will say, well, okay, I don't like that teacher because people teach in different ways. By the way, you got to ask the question, what's the difference between a teacher and a preacher? Well, they're very much overlapping. Preacher in the New Testament, the simple idea is just someone who proclaims the truth. Jesus is the Son of God. He has been crucified, and you might say repent and believe the gospel as they did. You're proclaiming the truths, but in such a way you're being a teacher at the same time. But a teacher really is kind of expounding upon. Now, I'm not a good preacher, I don't think. I'm not gifted with great speeches and a fantastic speaking voice. But what I'm comfortable doing anyway, and whether I'm good at it or not, I don't know, but I like to expound upon the things and bring out the truths and the intricacies. That's what I like to do. So I feel like if I have a gift, that's what I try to utilize. But different preachers, different gifts. You have other gifts. But to focus on this lift, you have elders, you have teachers. Elders are told in the New Testament to always be ready to teach. And even in the list, there's some overlap. Okay, then it says, for the equipping of the saints, for the saints, Holy One, the Christians, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of service to the building up of the body of Christ, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and the full knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man, to the measure of the stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ. And then it goes on to contrast this, so that we are not children. Okay, he wants us to be mature men. Okay, so the gifts are given so that the church can be built up and mature. Now, I can't spend too much time because we're kind of running out of time here. But the question is asked, okay, we acknowledge some in this list of gifts came with the miraculous. The apostles were inspired. Prophets, of course. A prophet is someone who, in the New Testament, had supernatural ability to receive and proclaim revelation. And this was for the equipping of the saints for building up. It says, until we mature. So the question is, well, and as I said, I don't want to get too much into the discussion because it would be too much for the time right now. But the debate between cessationists, for those of us who believe the miraculous age has ended, supernatural gifts, not that God doesn't do miracles. Hey, nobody could say that he doesn't do miracles. But that the gifts of the miraculous gifts have ceased. Okay, those cessationists. And then there's continuationists. Charismatic persuasions, Pentecostals. A lot of Calvinists, our friends, Calvinists, who are not charismatic, are not Pentecostal, I should say, but still are charismatic. A lot of people don't realize that. The Calvinists, a lot of them do believe in are continuationists. So the idea, they will say, well, you see, the gifts have to continue, the supernatural, because there's a list of gifts, some of which are involved with the supernatural, and we're not a mature church, so it has to be continuing. And that is the question. Let me digress from that. The idea, is the church mature? Have we reached that state? Well, I'll say a couple things. Number one, it is a good question. How do you define maturity? He says, no longer children tossed around by every wind of doctrine. Well, I have to admit, I don't know of any unified group that doesn't kind of have differences, various differences. There ain't no group I know of. You name them, Baptist, Pentecostal, Churches of Christ, all of them have divisions. I mean, there ain't total unity in any of them. So the question is, what church, isn't divided? Well, admittedly, it's a big discussion for now, but I'm going to say this. We all acknowledge, number one, whatever the state of the church, is the church in mature now? Is that the state? Has it reached that state? Okay, we don't longer believe in the miraculous, right? So are we conceding that the church is mature? Well, first, let me say this. Except for the Pentecostals, with every other charismatic and continuationist, we all agree that the apostles is no longer a position in the church. So when it says, if the argument is, no, the gifts that are involved with the miraculous has to still be happening because the church ain't mature yet. Well, even if I grant to them that the church has not reached this state of maturity, That does not necessitate that every gift in the list and that which is miraculous still continues, because you don't have apostles and prophets, which, at least with apostles, we could all agree on, excluding our Pentecostal friends. But there's a lot of charismatic that are not Pentecostal, and most of which would say, yeah, we don't have the apostles anymore. You see, but the gifts were given for and attaining a state of maturity. But wait a minute, if you don't have the apostles, then what good is the gift for us? Well, no, the gift was given and still continues to benefit us. I already talked about that. Do we not have the letters and the work of the apostles still yet? So the gift was given, the apostles in this example, who were involved with the miraculous and the supernatural gifts, and yet they are no longer around, but they still continue, and we still use them for maturing and building up the body through their work. And I believe the same thing is with the prophets. So you don't have to have the miraculous continuing. You have that which resulted from the gifts involved with the miraculous that still continue to work for the maturity of the church and the building up of them. Now, but then I'm going to say this. I believe there is a sense in which the church is mature. Now, if you define maturity in the sense of it's never going to disagree on doctrine, well, yeah, you can never say that they're mature. And that is one of their arguments, by the way. No, the gifts will continue till Christ returns, because only then will we stop disagreeing on doctrine. Well, I don't know that he says you'll never disagree. He just says that the church is able to notice that the differences between child and adult. I know you've heard me say this 1,000 times, but it's very applicable, because that's what he says. But children, what do they need? They need external control. They need external guidance. They need other people saying, do this, don't do this. Well, that was the state of the early church, because they didn't have a New Testament. Everything was new. They were getting piecemeal information from teachers and prophets and apostles. Apostles had to come, reestablish truths. Even in 1 Corinthians 15, when you think, well, they didn't know about the resurrection. They knew about the resurrection. Paul needed to reestablish it and say, okay, let me tell you about the resurrection, and I preached this to you. So, but now, what's the difference? What does an adult do? He has internal control. The church has the New Testament. Doesn't need for its existence the apostles to come. And we need to know this. We got this amount of revelation that Christ has given the church, and we use it to self-propel ourselves, to educate ourselves. Yes, we're not perfect, right? We're not omniscient. We still disagree on things, and we have to deal with that. And as individuals, we have immature Christians. But the church has the New Testament when it's able to propel itself through the ages until Christ's return without apostles and prophets. Now, do we still have teachers? Yeah, because that's how you use their work. So it depends on how you define a mature man and the state that he's talking about. But nevertheless, the idea is still, we don't need the supernatural still, because the work of those who had it still continues to be the same tool that we use always for the maturity of Christians. Okay, I got to bring this to a close. But I'll say this. In verse 14, the trickery of men, the craftiness and deceitful scheming. Well, there's never going to be a time in which you don't have to be on guard against error, and the only way to do that is by the use of Scripture and study. But no doubt, it's always something we have warnings throughout the New Testament to be on guard against. And the only way to do that is to study, to be informed. Speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up. Now, this last line, in verse 16, from whom the whole body being joined and held together by what every joint supplies. This is all about, I believe, the same state that he's wanting the church to progress in. it supplies itself, it strengthens itself, and that's what we do. And it'd be fantastic. I've said it a million times. I wish there was an apostle I can go and ask, hey, can you explain this? Because we've been debating this passage for eons. Can you tell me, what did he mean here? Might be the first thing I do if I see Paul. I said, Paul, I want to ask you about Romans 5, verse 12. What was happening there? That kind of thing. So I'd love to go to an apostle and say, hey, just could you clear this up? But what we always do now is we take the New Testament and we strengthen ourselves, we educate ourselves, we build ourselves up. That's what the gifts were given in the first place for. So each one of us is a part of the body, right? Fingers, toes, eyelashes, eyebrows. I mean, we may not always be the glorious part. Who wants to be an eyebrow? Well, but I'll tell you, without the eyebrows, that sweat is going to be stinging your eyes all the time. So every person has their gift, whether small, large, whatever it may be. We build ourselves up. That's what the gifts are for. We continue to use them to this day.